They thought a single mom and her little girl were easy prey, just another quiet family in a forgotten playground. Mocking voices, boots in the dirt, and nowhere to run. But when the bikers closed in, someone unexpected stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't bluff. With the calm of a soldier who had seen far worse, he stood between danger and innocence. By morning, the whole town whispered his name. Who was a man carrying dignity instead of medals? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The swing creaked with every gentle push, its chains groaning softly as if echoing the weariness of the woman who stood behind it. Emily Harper kept her hand steady, guiding her daughter forward and back. Forward and back, the rhythm as old as childhood itself. The playground was nearly empty, the kind of forgotten place where paint peeled from the metal slides and weeds pushed through cracks in the blacktop. A faded basketball hoop leaned at an angle, its net long gone, and the merry-go-round sat rusting in the far corner. The late afternoon air carried the chill of early autumn, sharp enough to remind them that winter was not far away. Leaves, orange and brittle, skittered across the pavement in little bursts whenever the wind shifted. Emily's jacket was too thin for the season. She pulled it tighter against her body, though she never stopped pushing the swing. Her dark hair was tied back in a hasty knot, strands already loose from the day's work. She had walked Lily here straight from the bus stop, determined to give her daughter at least an hour of play before dinner. It was the only part of the day that belonged fully to them, a space of freedom before homework, chores, and the endless reminders of bills stacked on the kitchen counter. She smiled whenever Lily glanced back at her, though behind that smile was exhaustion, etched deep in the corners of her eyes. Lily laughed as the swing lifted her higher. Her sneakers, scuffed and too small for another season, kicked toward the sky. She had the boundless energy of a child who believed the whole world might rise to meet her feet. Her voice carried in short bursts, singing half a song she had learned in school, mixing it with giggles that broke the monotony of the deserted park. Emily kept her attention fixed on her, letting the sound wash away some of the heaviness that always threatened to return. No one else lingered at the playground that day. A couple of boys had been shooting hoops earlier, but they had left once the light began to fade. Now it was only the swing, the wind, and the two of them, mother and daughter, cocooned in a fragile peace. Emily looked out at the horizon beyond the cracked chain-link fence. The sun was lowering, staining the sky with streaks of gold and pale pink. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, turning the old structures into silhouettes of more vibrant past. Emily thought, not for the first time, of how much her daughter deserved more than this. The rundown playground, the second-hand clothes, the mother who carried both worry and determination in equal measure. But Lily never seemed to notice. To her, the swing was a rocket ship, the sky her only limit. Emily admired that innocence, tried to hold on to it for both of them. The chains creaked again, louder this time, and Emily steadied with her hand as the swing slowed. Lily twisted in the seat, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. "Higher, Mom," she pleaded, her voice eager and insistent. Emily managed another smile and pushed harder, sending her daughter soaring once more. For a moment, the worry scattered like the leaves at her feet. The playground might have been worn down. The world might have been heavy, but in the rhythm of the swing and the laughter of her child, there was still something worth holding on to. The light dimmed further, the kind of hour when quiet felt fragile. Emily glanced at the parking lot beside the playground, noting how empty it was, how the stillness seemed to amplify every sound. She brushed the thought aside, focusing on Lily's joy, and pushed the swing again, steady and strong, as the chains groaned into the fading day. Emily's smile came easily for her daughter, but it never reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile that lived on borrowed strength, the sort that mothers learn to perfect when the world demands more than they have to give. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other mother at the playground, steady and patient as she pushed her little girl on the swing. But the truth of her life clung to her in the details, in the edges most people overlooked. The jacket she wore had once been a deeper shade of navy, but time had worn it thin. The cuffs were frayed, seams straining near the elbows where fabric had been patched over and over again. Her sneakers, dull gray and flattened at the soles, were too worn to keep out the damp chill that crept in with each season. The elastic holding her hair back had been stretched so many times it no longer kept the strands in place, leaving loose wisps to frame her face. None of it mattered to Lily, who looked back at her mother with eyes full of trust and delight. For the girl, her mother's tired smile was enough. Emily knew that, and it was why she never let it falter. Each push of the swing carried with it the unspoken promise that her daughter would always have at least this much joy, no matter what else they lacked. She forced brightness into her voice whenever Lily asked her to push harder, higher, faster. It didn't matter that her back ached from long hours at work, or that her hands bore the cracks of washing dishes in water that never seemed to stay warm enough. The only thing that mattered was that her daughter never saw the weariness gnawing at her. The playground echoed with Lily's laughter, and Emily clung to it. It was a shield against the thought she could not let her daughter see. The bills waiting at home, the rent due in 2 weeks, the landlord's reminders becoming sharper with every month. She had learned to fold those worries into the background, to keep them hidden behind the smile she wore for Lily's sake. The world might weigh heavily on her shoulders, but she would not let it touch her daughter. Not here, not in this moment. The breeze tugged at her hair, and she shivered inside the thin jacket. She remembered the years before, when she had first bought it new, when her life had felt full of possibility rather than limitation. Back then, she had thought she and Lily's father would weather anything. But promises had a way of unraveling, and now it was just the two of them. She didn't regret the path she had chosen. Her daughter was proof of that, but it meant a life stitched together from scraps. Each day held steady by willpower more than circumstance. Still, Emily held her smile. When Lily looked at her, none of that pain showed. She had grown used to hiding it, tucking exhaustion into the corners of her body, burying hunger behind coffee and determination, and softening her voice so that it always sounded reassuring. If her sneakers pinched, if her jacket let in the cold, it didn't matter. Her daughter's laughter was worth the price. She pressed her palms against the swing chains and pushed again, feeling the strain in her shoulders, but forcing herself to match Lily's rhythm. As the swing soared, Emily lifted her face toward a fading light, letting it bathe her expression. For a brief instant, she allowed herself to believe the smile wasn't forced at all. The sound reached her before the sight of them. At first, it was little more than a low murmur in the distance, a vibration carried on the cool autumn air, blending with the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the pavement. But as the seconds passed, the murmur deepened into a steady growl. Emily stiffened without realizing it, her hands tightening on the swing's chains as she gave Lily another push. The playground had been silent until now, cocooned in the solitude of a late afternoon when most families had already gone home. The intrusion of engines shattered that fragile peace. The noise swelled as the motorcycles came into view, dark shapes rolling into the cracked parking lot at the edge of the playground. The bikes gleamed in patches where chrome caught the fading sunlight, but most were dull with where mufflers patched, paint chipped, exhaust coughing between growls. The men riding them carried themselves with the practiced arrogance of people who knew their presence drew eyes. Black leather jackets bore faded patches, jeans were torn at the knees, and boots hit the ground heavy when they swung off their bikes. They filled the air with the smell of gasoline and cigarette smoke as they cut the engines and stood in a loose cluster near the lot's entrance. Emily's stomach tightened. She told herself not to stare, not to make eye contact, but her instincts pressed her to remain alert. She tried to keep her movements casual, steadying the swing as Lily laughed and kicked her legs forward, oblivious to anything beyond the arc of the ride. Emily forced her smile again, though it felt brittle, stretched too tight across her face. She didn't want her daughter to notice the sudden change in her posture, the way her shoulders had risen and her breath had caught. The men's laughter carried across the grass. It wasn't the light-hearted laughter of friends sharing a joke. It was rough, sharp at the edges, meant to be heard. One of them tossed a cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot, glancing toward the swings. The others followed his gaze, their conversation dipping before one of them said something low that sparked another round of laughter. The sound traveled easily in the open air, slicing into the quiet space Emily had tried to protect. The playground seemed smaller now. Every squeak of the swing felt too loud, every gust of wind too quick. Emily considered gathering Lily and leaving, but she hesitated. If she hurried too suddenly, it would draw attention, perhaps even provoke something she wasn't prepared to face. And yet, standing still felt just as dangerous. The men weren't approaching yet, but the weight of their presence pressed down on her. She could feel their eyes sweeping the park, lingering on the only mother and child who remained there. She leaned close to the swing, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, whispering encouragement that was more for herself than for the girl. "One more minute," she said softly, though her daughter only nodded and asked for another push. The sound of the engine still seemed to echo even after they were silenced, reverberating in Emily's chest like a warning. She adjusted her stance, grounding herself against the cool earth beneath her sneakers, the frayed soles gripping the pavement unevenly. From across the lot, the bikers began moving as a group, their boots crunching gravel, their voices carrying as they traded words she couldn't quite make out. Emily felt the air thicken with a sense of being cornered, of danger coiling itself nearby. She held onto the swing's chain as if steadying not only her daughter but also herself, telling her body to stay calm, to stay still. Even as the echo of those engines seemed to promise that the quiet of this playground had just been broken for good, Emily kept her gaze fixed on the swing, watching the way the afternoon light caught the tips of Lily's hair as it lifted and fell with each arc. She focused on the rhythm of the movement, on the small squeak of the chains, anything to keep her attention steady. Her hands moved automatically, pushing forward, pulling back, giving her daughter the momentum she craved. But beneath that practiced motion, every muscle in her body had gone taut. The sound of the motorcycles cutting off still lingered in her ears, a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. She sensed their presence before she dared to look. The scrape of boots against gravel, the crackle of a lighter flicking open, the faint hiss of tobacco catching flame. Smoke drifted into the air, carried by the breeze, reaching her even from a distance. She drew in a slow breath, keeping her movements deliberate, careful. To turn her head too quickly would be to admit awareness, and awareness might invite attention. She wasn't ready for that. The laughter started low, a rumble passed between them, words muttered under their breath, punctuated by sharp bursts of amusement that carried across the empty space. Emily's shoulders rose almost imperceptibly with each sound, her body betraying the fear she tried to bury beneath calm. She knew the type, men who prowled in groups, who tested boundaries not with outright violence at first, but with the steady press of presence, of eyes that lingered too long. Their kind drew power for the discomfort of others, feeding on the unease they created. Lily tilted her head back to look at her, smiling wide as the swing rose high. "Higher, Mom! Push me higher!" she called, her voice clear and full of joy. Emily forced her lips into a smile, nodding, giving another firm push. She prayed her daughter couldn't see the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flicked quickly toward the edge of the lot before darting back to the safety of a swing. The men had spread slightly, no longer clustered tightly around the bikes. One leaned against a post, exhaling smoke through his nose, eyes fixed on the playground. Another kicked at the gravel with his boot, his chin lifting as though marking territory with the tilt of his gaze. Their movements were casual, but calculated, each one aware of how visible they were. They hadn't stepped closer yet, but their attention was sharp, deliberate. Emily felt heat rise in her chest, not from anger, but from the raw awareness of being seen, judged, and measured. Her jacket suddenly seemed thinner, her hair tie looser, her shoes more worn. Every detail of her appearance felt like something they might seize upon. Another reason to laugh, to sneer, to make her smaller than she already felt. She fought the instinct to gather Lily into her arms and flee, because rushing would only make them certain they had power over her. So she stayed still, steady, pushing the swing, eyes narrowed against the lowering sun. The smoke carried again, drifting to the fading light, curling like a signal in the air. Emily knew they were waiting, deciding how much to press, how far to step into the quiet she had tried to carve out for her daughter. She pressed her palm against the chain, gave one more push, and told herself that as long as she kept her focus on Lily, as long as she made it look like the world beyond the swing didn't matter, maybe the men would lose interest. But she felt their eyes sweeping over her again, and she knew the piece of the playground had already been broken. The sound reached her in fragments at first, carried unevenly by the shifting breeze. A low chuckle, then the sharp crack of a laugh, followed by a voice pitched deliberately loud enough to travel across the open space. Emily did not catch every word, but she caught enough. The tone was unmistakable, mocking, jagged, the kind of laughter that made the air feel colder. One of the men raised his arm, pointing in her direction, his voice cutting across the playground with feigned casualness. She couldn't make out the exact words, but the way the others erupted afterward told her it had been about her. Her hand tightened around the swing chain, the metal biting into her palm. She kept her eyes on Lily, who leaned back in the seat, legs kicking out toward the fading sky, blissfully unaware of the way the atmosphere around them had shifted. Emily forced a smile, her lips trembling with the effort, and pushed the swing again, making her movement smooth, as though nothing had changed. She knew, though, that everything had. The laughter came again, louder this time, with no attempt to disguise the intent. A phrase floated clearly this time. All alone out here. Another voice followed, lower, edged with derision. Figures. Then came the whistle, long, drawn out, dripping with insinuation. Emily's chest tightened, as if the sound itself were a hand pressing against her ribs. She swallowed hard, refusing to let the fear take shape on her face. The playground felt exposed, every inch or two open, too vulnerable. There was no crowd to disappear into, no other families to serve as a buffer. Just her daughter, and a cluster of men who found entertainment in circling prey they hadn't even fully approached yet. She shifted her stance slightly, placing her body more firmly between the swing and the line of their gaze, her shoulders squared as though that could form a wall. Lily twisted in the seat, looking back at her with wide eyes. "What's funny?" she asked innocently, catching the sound of the laughter though not its meaning. Emily leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek, and whispered softly, "Nothing you need to worry about. Keep swinging, baby." Her voice was gentle, steady, though her throat felt dry. The bikers continued their commentary, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp and deliberate, always followed by harsh bursts of amusement. Their voices carried easily in the stillness, each word chosen to slice through the space between them and the playground. Emily caught snippets. Lonely, easy, look at her. Each word lodged inside her like a stone, heavy and cold. She straightened her back, refusing to let her posture betray the turmoil beneath her skin. She told herself that if she kept calm, if she showed no reaction, perhaps they would lose interest. But another part of her knew that silence often drew them in further, that indifference was seen as challenge rather than defense. Her heart beat fast, but her hand stayed steady, pushing the swing in the same measured rhythm. The sun had dipped lower, shadows stretching longer across the cracked pavement. Emily could feel the weight of their stares even when she didn't look. The air charged with something waiting to break. The mocking laughter rolled again, jagged and deliberate, filling the emptiness where only a mother and child's laughter should have been. Emily kept her face composed, her smile fixed for Lily's sake, even as the sound carried across the grass and pressed closer, reminding her how very alone they were in that moment. Lily's voice was small, almost swallowed by the cool air that moved restlessly across the playground. She had heard the laughter too, felt its edge without understanding its intent. Children had a way of sensing what words alone could not explain, and the shift in her mother's body told her more than the sounds carrying across the grass. Emily's shoulders were tense, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the swing's chains with more force than the gentle push should have required. Lily tilted her head slightly, peering up at her, her dark eyes searching for an answer. "Mom," she whispered, a question packed into a single syllable. Emily forced her smile, though the effort trembled in the corners of her mouth. She bent forward, brushing her daughter's hair back from her forehead, as if her hands could shield her from the weight pressing in from the distance. "Keep swinging, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft, calm, carefully measured. She pushed the swing again, steady and strong, as though nothing had changed, though her fingers curled tightly against the cold metal links. Lily looked uncertain, her brows furrowed, the joy of the swing momentarily dimmed by the unease in her mother's tone. She glanced toward the parking lot, toward the cluster of men leaning against their motorcycles, their voices carrying sharp bursts of laughter that cut through the fading light. She didn't understand their words, not fully, but she understood the way they stared. It was not the casual glance of strangers passing by, but something heavier, unsettling. Lily's hand tightened on the swing's worn plastic seat, as though holding on could keep her anchored. Emily noticed a shift in her daughter's expression and pressed another smile onto her face, one that didn't belong to her but to the role she played every day. Protector, provider, the steady force that would not let her child see the cracks forming beneath the surface. "Don't mind them," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Just keep swinging. I'm right here." She placed her palm on her daughter's back and gave another push, higher this time, making the chains creak louder. The sound of it filled the air for a moment, drowning out the laughter from across the grass. But Emily's body betrayed her. Her hands trembled slightly as she steadied the swing, and the rhythm of her breathing had changed, shallow and uneven. She kept her eyes fixed on Lily, refusing to look toward the men, as though ignoring them could erase them from existence. Yet she felt them still, the way of their eyes crawling across the playground, pressing against her skin like heat. Lily twisted in her seat, legs dangling as the swing slowed. "Mom," she said again, her voice more insistent now. "Why are they laughing?" The question landed like a stone in Emily's chest. She crouched quickly, lowering her face to her daughter's level, her own expression calm though her heart raced. "It doesn't matter," she said softly, brushing her thumb across Lily's cheek. "They don't matter. You just enjoy your swing." The words were meant to soothe, but even as she spoke them, Emily felt the hollowness inside. The men had not moved closer yet, but their laughter lingered, circling like vultures waiting to decide if the moment was worth claiming. She forced herself to stand again, her back straight, her hands steady on the chains. "One more push," she said, her voice firm, disguising fear's control. Lily hesitated, then nodded, trusting her mother, letting her legs stretch forward once more as the swing carried her higher into the dimming sky. Emily's eyes flicked briefly toward the parking lot, just long enough to confirm what she already knew. The bikers had not lost interest. Their smoke curled upward, their gazes fixed, their laughter sharp. She turned back quickly, hiding her fear behind another smile, because for Lily's sake, she could not afford to let the truth show. The sound of boots grinding against gravel broke the fragile rhythm of the swing. Emily didn't need to look up to know the men were moving closer. She heard the shift in their laughter, no longer distant, no longer lazy amusement from the safety of the parking lot. It had sharpened, directed, shaped into words that carried with deliberate weight. The cadence of their steps across the grass was slow, purposeful, the kind of approach meant to be noticed. Lily leaned back in the swing, her hair catching the dying light as she looked upward, still waiting for the push. Emily's hands faltered against the chain, her body going rigid. She forced herself to keep moving, to give another push, though it came out weaker than before. The squeak of the swing filled the air for a moment, but then the voices cut through, closer now. "Out here all alone," one called. His voice ruffled the gravel of too many cigarettes and cheap whiskey. He let the words stretch, filling the space like a taunt. Another voice followed, younger, sharper, dripping with mock concern. "Where's your man at? You don't got someone looking out for you." The third barked out a laugh, low and crude, as though the question itself were the punchline. Emily's throat tightened. She knew better than to respond, knew better than to invite engagement, but silence was its own kind of answer. She steadied the swing again, pushing with more force than she intended, just to keep Lily moving, to give her daughter something to focus on besides men closing in. The chains groaned in protest, but Lily laughed, oblivious to the undercurrent of fear thickening around them. The men kept walking, their boots heavy against the soft earth now. She could see them in the corner of her vision, dark shapes cutting across the grass, their jackets creaking with every step. The smell of smoke followed them, wrapping around the clean chill of the autumn evening. Emily wanted to step back, to pull Lily from the swing and hurry away, but doing so would mean turning her back, exposing herself, showing fear. Instead, she tightened her grip on the chains and raised her chin, forcing her body into a posture of quiet defiance. One of them laughed again, closer this time, and said, "What kind of mom brings her kid out here alone? Ain't safe, you know." His tone was mocking, but underneath it, there was an edge she recognized, the testing of boundaries. Another chimed in, his voice lower, almost a growl. Maybe she's looking for company. The laughter that followed sent a shiver crawling up her spine. Lily turned her head, sensing the shift even without understanding the words. "Mom," she whispered, uncertainty trembling in her voice. Emily forced herself to smile, though her lips felt brittle, and gave another push on the swing. "It's fine," she murmured. "Just keep playing." But her words felt thin, powerless against the weight of 3 men pressing closer with each step. The space around the playground seemed to shrink. The open grass that felt wide and empty moments ago now felt like a trap, every path leading back toward the men. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, her breath shallow as she tried to calculate, tried to plan. She told herself to stand tall, to not show weakness, but the truth pressed hard in her chest. She was alone, and they knew it. The men stopped just short of the swings, their presence looming like a shadow cast too long. One drew on his cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward, his eyes locked on her with a mixture of amusement and intent. "So what's the story, sweetheart?" he asked. "No man to keep you warm? No one watching your back?" Emily's fingers curled tighter around the swing chains, her knuckles pale. She met his gaze for the briefest moment, then shifted her eyes back to Lily. "Keep swinging," she said softly, almost a whisper, her voice steady for her daughter's sake alone. The laughter that followed from the men was harsher than before, ringing in the empty playground, and Emily knew they were not finished. They were only beginning. Emily felt the ground tilt beneath her, as though the very earth conspired to make her knees give way. Fear had weight, pressing into her chest until every breath felt like it might crack something inside. Her body screamed to run, to scoop Lily up and flee across the grass, but she knew there was no safety in turning her back. The men would only take that as permission to chase, to circle closer. She had nothing but her presence, her body, and the stubborn refusal to yield. So she planted her feet. With one hand, she steadied the swing, slowing its arc until it came to a stop, and with the other she brushed a hand over Lily's shoulder. The child looked up, confusion clouding her face, sensing the tension without fully grasping its danger. Emily's chest ached as she forced herself to step forward, placing her body between her daughter and the men. Her voice came out thin at first, caught between trembling nerves and the need to sound unshaken. "That's close enough." The words slipped into the open air, swallowed for a moment by the quiet, but then hung there, firm enough that even she was surprised by them. The men exchanged looks, their amusement sparking again at her defiance. One with a jagged scar across his cheek smirked, exhaling smoke from the corner of his mouth. "Relax, lady. We're just talking." His tone carried the heavy weight of mockery, making clear that talk was never all they intended. Emily's hands curled into fists at her sides. She could feel her heart beating so hard it rattled her ribs, yet she forced her voice to return, steadier this time. "My daughter's here. You don't belong this close." She heard the slight crack in her words, the tremor she couldn't erase, but the sentence itself held. She had spoken, and she would not take it back. Behind her, Lily gripped the chains of the swing, shrinking into the seat, her small knuckles pale. Emily didn't turn to comfort her. She couldn't, not yet, but she kept her body square, her back straight, shoulders set as though she could absorb whatever storm tried to break through. The second man, taller and broader than the rest, laughed under his breath. "Look at her," he muttered to the others, standing guard like some kind of soldier. His words cut deep, but they also revealed something unexpected. They had noticed her stance. She wasn't cowering, wasn't pleading. She was holding ground. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and spoke again, quieter but more resolved. "You've had your fun. Go." The command surprised even her. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The strength in her voice came from the raw determination not to let her daughter see her crumble. The scarred man tilted his head, studying her, smoke curling from his lips. "Feisty," he said with a grin. His companions chuckled, but there was hesitation threaded through the sound. Something about the way she stood, Rigid, protective, unwilling to shrink, disrupted the easy flow of intimidation they thrived on. Emily's pulse thundered, her body taut like a bowstring. She knew she was one wrong word away from collapse, but still she held. Fear pressed harder, threatening to break her from within. Yet she found her anchor in the warmth of the child behind her. For Lily's sake, she would not fold. For Lily's sake, her voice would not break completely. The laughter faded slightly, the space thick with uncertainty. Emily stood taller, chest rising, shoulders squared, her presence the only shield she had. And though the weight of fear pressed against every breath, she remained in place, a mother standing between her child and the men who thought they could strip away her dignity. At the far edge of the park, a man slowed his steps, the plastic handles of a paper bag cutting faint grooves into his fingers. Daniel Reyes had not expected company when he decided to cut to the playground on his walk home. It was a long way, but he liked it. Liked the silence, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the way the evening air felt sharper on this side of town. He had walked this path enough times to know the ordinary rhythms of the place. A mother and her child on the swings fit that rhythm. The cluster of men closing in on them did not. He stopped near the line of trees, shifting his weight, letting his eyes narrow as he studied the scene. The woman had stepped in front of the swing, her frame tense but unyielding, her voice carrying faintly across the open space. The little girl clung to the chains, too young to understand the full danger, but not too young to sense it. The three men in leather jackets loomed nearby, their postures loose, but their intent written plainly enough in the way they laughed, the way they pointed, the way they stood too close. Daniel felt the air change his chest, a tightening he hadn't experienced in years but still recognized immediately. The memory of situations like this, unbalanced, unfair, the strong circling the vulnerable, returned with unsettling clarity. He had seen that look before, men testing limits, feeding off fear, certain no one would stop them. His hand flexed slightly against the paper bag, the items inside shifting. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a tin of coffee. Small, ordinary things meant for the quiet evening he had planned. But quiet evenings had a way of being broken. He studied the woman's stance, the way her shoulders squared even though her hands trembled. Courage, he thought. Not the loud kind, not the kind that declared itself, but the quiet kind that held the line even when it shook. He felt an old ache stir in his chest, the ache of recognition, of knowing what it meant to stand between danger and someone who depended on you. The men hadn't noticed him yet. Their laughter still cut across the grass, jagged and deliberate, filling the air with mockery. Daniel adjusted the cap on his head, tugging the brim lower against the setting sun. His expression hardened, eyes narrowing further as he gauged the distance. He could walk away. It wasn't his fight, but his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he set the bag down carefully on a bench, the wood creaking under its weight. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving him time to think, to breathe, to let the steady rhythm of his training return to him. He straightened, shoulders broad beneath the worn jacket, and fixed his gaze on the men as though marking them one by one. From where he stood, he could hear the woman's voice again, faint but firm, telling them to stop, to leave. Her voice wavered, but it did not break. He admired that. Still, he saw the way the men leaned closer, saw the way they tested the edge of her resolve. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had spent too many years in uniform, too many nights in places where silence could mean death, to ever ignore the call of imbalance when it stared him in the face. His boots pressed into the ground as he took his first step forward, quiet but firm, each stride deliberate, the distance shrinking between him and the confrontation at the swings. His eyes never left the men, steady and sharp, narrowing further as if he could cut through their bravado with nothing more than the weight of his gaze. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on holding her ground, shielding her daughter with nothing but her presence. But Daniel had noticed, and that was enough. He would not let it continue. Daniel didn't move quickly. The instinct to charge in, to break the tension with a show of force, tug at the edges of his muscles, but years of discipline held him in place. He lowered the paper bag carefully onto the bench, the quiet thud of bread and coffee muffled by the rustle of paper. His hands lingered on it for a moment, as though anchoring himself, before he straightened. The brim of his cap caught the last slant of light, and with a small, practiced adjustment, he pulled it lower, shadowing his eyes. He stood still, boots planted firmly on the worn path, and let his gaze move across the scene with deliberate calm. He had learned long ago that rushing into a situation without reading it first was a mistake. Observation was as much a weapon as action. He watched the way the woman held her body, rigid, protective, a wall of flesh and bone standing between her daughter and three men who circled with the casual cruelty of predators that had found a target. He caught the faint tremor in her shoulders, but he also saw the way she did not retreat. The little girl clung to the swing, her face tilted upward in confusion, small fists white against the chains. She didn't cry. She looked to her mother for reassurance, for answers, and though fear whispered at the edges of her features, she trusted the barrier her mother formed. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight, memory tugging at him. Faces from other places, other years, people he had stood for when no one else would. The details blurred, but the feeling never left. The men were loud now, their laughter forced, exaggerated, each word meant to wound. They moved slowly, testing boundaries, their boots pressing deeper into the grass with every step. Their voices carried phrases Daniel didn't need to hear in full to understand. Crude comments about being alone, about no man standing beside her. It was the same tone he had heard in alleys overseas, in bars too close to bases, in towns where power was measured not in justice, but in how much fear you could create. He folded his arms across his chest, a casual posture to anyone glancing his way, but his eyes missed nothing. He studied the distance between them, the lines of their shoulders, the way they leaned in but hadn't yet closed the final gap. He measured their confidence, their reliance on numbers, and weighed it against the brittle edge of their laughter. Men like that expected easy victories. They rarely knew what to do when confronted with someone who wouldn't flinch. The woman's voice rose faintly again. Daniel tilted his head to catch it. Her words were few, simple commands for them to stop, for them to step back. The tremor in her voice was there, yes, but so was steel. He respected that. It was not easy to speak when fear threatened to choke the air from your lungs. She had spoken anyway. He let the silence stretch within himself, steadying his breathing into the sounds of the playground. The squeak of the swing, the laughter of the men, the rustle of leaves became details in a larger picture. His patience was not hesitation. It was calculation, the same kind he had relied on countless times before. He would move, but not yet, not until he knew the shape of what needed to be done. From his place near the bench, Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his boots whispering against the ground. His eyes stayed fixed on the men. They hadn't noticed him fully yet, too consumed by their own bravado. That would change soon enough. For now, he remained still, the kind of stillness that carried weight, watching long enough to know that when he stepped forward, there would be no question about why he had come. The space between them shrank quickly, the kind of shrinking that made every breath feel heavier. Emily could feel it in her bones as the three men abandoned pretense and let their steps carry them fully into the playground. Boots pressed into the thinning grass, scattering brittle leaves, until their presence was no longer just a weight across the lot, but a force bearing down at arm's length. One drifted slightly to the side, casual in movement but deliberate in intent, circling as though he were drawing an invisible net around her and Lily. Another leaned forward as he walked, chin tilted, eyes sweeping her body with the indifference of someone who saw not a person but an opportunity. Their words came sharper now, no longer muttered for each other's amusement, but spoken loud enough to pierce the quiet. Easy prey. One spat with a grin, the words tossed like a hook into the air. The others caught it, laughter cutting hard and sudden before another voice followed. Figures. A single mom out here alone. No one to keep her safe. The emphasis on alone echoed, each syllable heavier than the last. As though designed to twist deeper into the silence, Emily tried to preserve for her daughter. She kept her stance rigid, shoulders squared, arms spread slightly as she held herself in front of the swing. Her hands trembled, but she did not back away. Lily's grip tightened on the chains behind her, and Emily could feel the small tugs against her jacket as the girl shifted, trying to hide behind her without leaving the seat. The sound of her daughter's breath, shallow and quick, was louder to Emily than the voices of the men. One of them exhaled smoke directly into the air, letting it drip between them like a wall he controlled. Bet it gets lonely, huh? No man around. Bet you wish you had some company now. His grin widened as he stepped closer, closing the last feet of space with the kind of swagger that dared her to resist. Emily's voice cracked before it steadied, but she forced out anyway. Stay back. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut the air. She could hear the tremor in her words, but she didn't care. Her body was the barrier, her voice the only weapon she had. They laughed again, harsher now, the sound bouncing off the metal of the slide, the rusted merry-go-round, filling the playground with cruelty. The one who had drifted behind shifted closer, his boots scraping the blacktop, his presence pressing into her back. She didn't turn to look, but the awareness burned across her skin. She tightened her fists, her chest rising and falling with deliberate effort, keeping herself steady for Lily's sake. The insults kept coming, crude words twisting around the phrase, single mom. Each one meant to remind her what she lacked, of how vulnerable she seemed. But even as they circled, Emily refused to step aside. Her fear pressed against her chest like a fist, but her body held firm. She blocked the swing, rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the men in front of her. The air thickened with their voices, their laughter, the scrape of boots as they shifted closer. The circle tightened. Emily's hands clenched until her nails bit into her palms. She felt Lily's small hand touch the edge of her jacket, clinging silently, and that was enough to keep her upright. Her fear might have been a storm inside her, but she would not let it show. Not here, not in front of her daughter. The men smirked as though they had already won. But for the first time, one of them faltered. His eyes shifted slightly, catching movement at the far end of the park. Emily didn't notice yet. She was too locked on the space in front of her, but the balance of the scene was beginning to tilt. Emily felt the faintest tug at her sleeve. So light it might have been mistaken for the wind, if not for the trembling that came with it. She glanced down and saw Lily's small hands clutching tight, her knuckles pale, her fingers gripping the fabric as though her mother were the only anchor in a storm she couldn't name. Lily's eyes, wide and shining, searched Emily's face for answers. The child leaned forward in the swing, voice so soft it was almost lost in the laughter still spilling from the men. "Let's go home," she whispered, the plea barely audible but heavy with fear. The words tore at Emily more than the insults circling them. She wanted nothing more than to take her daughter's hand, to walk away, to put distance between them and the men who fed on intimidation. But when she shifted slightly, ready to guide Lily off the swing, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. The path to the parking lot was cut off. One of the bikers had already drifted behind them, his boots dragging deliberately on the pavement, his posture loose but menacing. Another stood angled toward the exit, leaning against a post as though guarding the only way out. Even the third, the one who leaned too close, had positioned himself where his body blocked the direct path forward. It wasn't a cage of walls, but it was no less confining. Emily's chest tightened. She bent slightly, brushing her daughter's hair back, trying to keep her own expression calm even as her pulse pounded. "It's okay," she whispered back, though the words scraped her throat. "I'm here. You're safe." The promise felt fragile, a ribbon stretched too thin, but she wrapped it around her daughter anyway. Lily's lip quivered, her eyes filling faster than she could blink them away. The tears spilled silently at first, sliding down her cheeks, then came heavier, her breath catching in short, uneven sobs. She tried to stay quiet, to hide it the way children sometimes do when they sense their crying might make things worse. But fear could not be held in forever. The sound broke from her, small and desperate, carrying through the tense air. The men noticed. One of them chuckled, tilting his head toward the swing. "Ah, look at that," he said, his tone sharp with mock sympathy. "Scaring the kid. Shame, ain't it?" His laughter was joined by the others, rough and jagged, louder now as though the girls' fear fueled their amusement. Emily's heart ached. She shifted her body closer, her arms spreading slightly as though she could shield Lily from their voices, from their eyes, from the cruelty that seemed to grow sharper with each second. She straightened her back, pulling her shoulders tall, hiding the way her hands shook at her sides. "Don't cry, sweetheart," she whispered, leaning back toward her daughter. I won't let them hurt you. But Lily's tears only came faster, soaking into the collar of her jacket. The swing chains rattled as she twisted, trying to pull herself deeper behind her mother. Emily stayed rooted, refusing to move even though every instinct screamed to scoop Lily up and run. The men had taken that choice from her. The air was heavy now, thick with tension and smoke. Each second stretched, punctuated by Lily's sobs, by the scrape of boots on pavement, by laughter that no longer carried the careless edge of joke, but something darker. Emily fought to keep her face calm, to keep her voice steady, but inside she felt herself unraveling. Still, she held fast, one hand resting against the swing's chain, the other hanging ready to reach for her daughter, if even one of the men dared step closer. "Let's go home," Lily whispered again through her tears, the words fragile breaking. Emily bent her head low enough that her cheek brushed the crown of her daughter's hair, her voice steady even as fear rattled through her bones. "We will," she promised softly. "I'll get us home." Whether or not she believed it, she spoke it as truth for her daughter and for herself. Daniel rose from the bench with the kind of movement that drew no attention to itself, yet carried weight all the same. His hands left the paper bag behind without hesitation, as though he had already accepted it might not be picked up again. He straightened his back slowly, the faint stiffness of age in his shoulders, but beneath it lay something steady, practiced, a strength that had never left him no matter how many years had passed. His boots pressed into ground with a low thud, and as he began to walk, each step carried a rhythm that seemed to cut across the laughter filling the playground. The men didn't notice him at first. Their voices still rang out in jagged bursts, circling the woman and child with words sharp enough to wound. But Daniel's presence began to alter the air, quiet at first, like the tightening of a rope before a pull. He walked with precision of memory, each step deliberate, not rushed, echoing faintly in his own mind like the cadence of patrols long gone. He did not hurry, for he knew that urgency often betrayed itself as desperation. Instead, he let the weight of his stride announce itself gradually. Emily was too focused on the men in front of her to see him yet. Her body remained stiff, shielding Lily from the circle closing in, her voice soft but shaking as she whispered assurances. She didn't hear the difference in sound behind her, didn't register the approaching boots until they were already halfway across the playground. Daniel kept his eyes locked on the three men. He watched the way the one at the front leaned in too close, his shoulders loose with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He saw the one circling behind, angling his stance as though preparing to block escape, and the one at the side, arms crossed, his smirk sharp in the fading light. Daniel studied them with the cold precision of a soldier cataloging threats, his eyes narrowing as though each detail mattered. It was the woman's trembling that struck him most. Not that she faltered, but that she stood anyway, body rigid between her daughter and the men who mocked her. He saw the child clinging to the swing, face wet with tears, whispering pleas to go home, and something in his chest tightened like an old wound pulled open. He knew the weight of fear, had carried it through nights darker than this one, and he recognized courage when he saw it. By the time the men finally noticed him, Daniel was already halfway to the swings. Their laughter dipped, not entirely silenced but softened, an edge of uncertainty cutting into it. One muttered something under his breath, glancing sideways. The one closest to Emily squinted, his grin faltering for just a breath as he measured the steady approach of a stranger who didn't avert his eyes, didn't slow his stride. The sound of Daniel's boots on the pavement filled the silence between jeers. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. His presence was its own language, each step like the toll of a warning bell, steady, deliberate, echoing with a memory of countless barracks hallways where discipline was learned step by step, silence by silence. He had not come rushing, but he had come, and with each footfall the balance of the playground began, slowly, to shift. Daniel stopped just short of the circle, his boots planted firmly on the cracked pavement, his hands loose at his sides. He didn't square his shoulders with forced bravado, nor did he lean forward in challenge. Instead, he stood with the unshakable stillness of a man who had nothing to prove. His gaze moved from one face to the next, cataloging, assessing, leaving no space for misinterpretation. The laughter that filled the air only moments before thinned as the bikers registered his presence. One shifted slightly, almost unconsciously, as if the ground beneath them had changed without warning. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried not with volume but with weight. "She told you no," he said, calm and clipped, each word measured with precision. His tone lacked fury, lacked flourish, but it carried the cadence of command, the kind that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. He let the silence hang for a beat before adding, "That means walk away." The men stared at him, caught for a moment between confusion and indignation. Their world was built on dominance, on loudness, on taking space and filling it with noise. This man had cut through all of it without raising his voice, and the simplicity of it unsettled them. One of them barked out a laugh, sharp and forced, as though trying to reclaim ground that had suddenly shifted beneath his boots. "Who the hell are you?" the tallest one asked, his voice edging toward anger. He took a step forward, squaring his shoulders as if to remind everyone where the power lay. The cigarette between his fingers burned low, ash trembling at the tip, but he didn't flick it away. Daniel's expression didn't change. His eyes stayed locked, steady as stone, his jaw set but relaxed. He didn't bother answering the question. He didn't need to give him a name, didn't need to announce himself with history or titles. The authority in his voice had already said enough. Emily felt the shift immediately. The air around her seemed to expand, as though she could take a deeper breath for the first time since the man had closed in. She didn't dare move, but her eyes flicked sideways, catching sight of him now, the broad frame, the worn jacket, the cap pulled low. She didn't know who he was, but she recognized what his presence meant. She was no longer standing alone. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado straining under the sudden stillness. They were used to sneers answered with fear, to taunts met with silence or trembling. But this man hadn't flinched, hadn't hesitated, hadn't raised his voice in return. He had simply spoken, and in that simplicity, there was something they couldn't quite pin down. The one who had circled behind Emily spat on the ground, his attempt at defiance thin. "This ain't your business, old man," he muttered. But even as he said it, his tone lacked conviction. He was testing, not declaring. Daniel didn't blink. His voice came again, calm as before, steady as a line drawn in the sand. "It is now." The words dropped heavy into the silence that followed, final and immovable. The laughter didn't return this time. Instead, the playground seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which direction the balance would tip. Emily's daughter clung tighter to the chains of the swing, her tears slowing as she looked from her mother to the man who had spoken. And for the first time since the engines had roared into the lot, Emily believed the night might not end the way it had begun. The silence Daniel carved into the air did not last long. It cracked, fractured by a burst of laughter, jagged and harsh. One of the bikers threw his head back, letting the sound spill out, forcing it to fill the playground the way a pack of dogs might bark louder when they feel the presence of something they don't understand. The others joined in, their laughter too loud, too sharp, masking the thin thread of unease had begun to creep into their posture. "Old man," the tallest one jeered, his grin flashing as he flicked the last of his cigarette to the ground. The ember hissed against the damp grass, and he ground it out with his boot, never taking his eyes off Daniel. "You think one guy like you is going to stop all of us?" His tone rose with mock incredulity, as if the very idea were absurd enough to be funny. The second one, the one who had drifted behind Emily, smirked as he circled back into view, his arms spread wide in exaggerated welcome. "Look at this," he called to the others. "Somebody's grandpa thinks he's still in charge of the playground." He spat into the dirt, his eyes narrowing as he studied Daniel more closely. The third biker laughed hardest, the kind of laugh that tried too hard, his shoulders shaking as he bent forward. "Man, you're in the wrong place if you think we're just going to walk away. This ain't storybook hero stuff. You're outnumbered and we don't scare easy." He dragged the toe of his boot across the blacktop, etching a shallow line in the pavement, as though marking a border Daniel was not meant to cross. Daniel did not move. He let their words hang in the air, let the laughter echo off the rusted merry-go-round and the leaning basketball hoop, until the sound seemed hollow against the calm of the silence. His eyes remained fixed, scanning their faces one by one, as though measuring the gap between bluster and reality. He had heard men laugh like this before, in different places, under harsher suns, the kind of laugh that tried to cover the doubt pressing at the edges. Emily stood frozen behind him, her hand still stretched toward the swing where Lily clung, wide-eyed. The child's sobs had quieted, her fear momentarily redirected toward the strange shift in power. She looked at the man who had stepped between them and the bikers, her small chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, uncertain but hopeful. The bikers grew louder, their jeers tumbling over one another, words sharpened into barbs. Walk away. Old man. Don't get yourself hurt. You don't even know what you're stepping into. They wanted him to react, to flinch, to show some crack they could widen. But Daniel's stillness unnerved them. His calm refusal to match their volume pressed back harder than any shout could have. One of them leaned closer, his grin widening, but his eyes flickered with a question he wouldn't voice. The others laughed again, but it carried less weight now. More noise and conviction. They told themselves they were mocking him, dismissing him, but the truth lingered in the quiet between their jeers. One man standing steady against them unsettled the easy script they had been so sure of. Daniel's expression did not change. He let the storm of their laughter wash over him without acknowledgement, as if their words could not touch him. And in that refusal, in that silence, the balance of playground shifted again, leaving the men to laugh louder than they needed to, hiding the first faint edge of doubt creeping into their bravado. The laughter lingered in the air like smoke, harsh and brittle, but Daniel did not rise to meet it. He stood exactly where he had stopped, shoulders square beneath his worn jacket, boots planted on the cracked pavement. His arms hung loose at his sides, relaxed but purposeful, his hands half open, not clenched into fists but not idle either. There was no twitch of unease in his frame, no shifting of weight as if he were reconsidering. He remained still, and the stillness itself began to feel louder than anything the bikers could say. Emily, who had braced herself for the crack of violence, for some sudden escalation, realized with start that nothing about him wavered. She noticed the way his back held straight, not rigid with tension, but steady in a way that suggested long habit, as though his body had been trained to anchor itself in moments when others would falter. The set of his shoulders reminded her of walls that did not buckle no matter how much storm raged around them. The bikers laughed louder, sensing something they could not name. Their words grew sharper, a blur of taunts meant to provoke. But Daniel's silence absorbed it all. He didn't look away, didn't blink too long, didn't allow the smallest crack for them to crawl into. He simply stood, and in that stillness there was a message. He was not there to play their game. He was not there to match insult for insult. He was there to end something before it began. The men exchanged glances without meaning to. It was subtle, a quick flick of eyes from one to the other, but Emily saw it. She had lived long enough to recognize the moment when bravado began to fracture, when men who thrived on dominance realized their noise was bouncing against something unyielding. Their laughter faltered, just slightly, replaced by the need to push harder, to regain ground that silence had stripped from them. Emily's breath came easier, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding it. For the first time, she allowed her eyes to settle fully on him. This stranger who had stepped into her nightmare without warning. He wasn't large in a way that relied on intimidation, but he carried himself with the presence of someone who knew exactly what he could do if pressed. His stillness was not weakness. It was choice. It was control. Behind her, Lily's grip on the swing's chain loosened just a fraction. The child peeked around her mother's side, her tears slowing as she fixed on the tall figure standing a few paces away. She didn't understand the subtleties of silence, but she recognized steadiness when she saw it. The sobs in her chest turned to shallow breaths, her body pressing against her mother less desperately. The bikers tried again. One leaned forward, smirking, his words sharp. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue." Another chuckled, adding, "Maybe he's just too scared to talk." But the words landed flat, as though they were bouncing against stone. Daniel's lack of reaction stripped them of power. Their laughter came again, but it rang hollow, stretched too thin by the unease creeping into their tone. The silence that Daniel held was not emptiness. It was filled with something heavier, a presence that seeped into the cracks of the moment. It reminded Emily of the quiet before a storm, the pause when the air itself feels too heavy to breathe, when nature seems to draw in its breath before breaking open. His posture, unshaken and immovable, carried the weight of experience, of someone who had stood in far worse places and come out intact. Emily straightened without realizing it, her shoulders squaring in unconscious imitation. The stranger's silence gave her permission to breathe, to believe that the balance might yet shift. She kept her body in front of her daughter, but for the first time she felt the edge of her fear soften, replaced with the faintest spark of hope. The bikers' voices faltered once more, caught in the strange power of a man who hadn't said another word. In that absence, in that refusal to meet their noise with his own, Daniel's presence grew larger, heavier, undeniable. And though the night hadn't yet broken, the playground felt different, less theirs, more contested, because one man stood steady, unshaken, and made silence louder than sound. The laughter, thin as it had become, needed fuel to survive. One of the bikers, broad in the shoulders, his jacket creased and heavy with patches, decided to provide it. His boots struck the pavement harder than necessary as he stepped forward, closing the gap between himself and Daniel until only a few feet of space remained. The others quieted, watching with anticipation, as though this would be the moment when their jeers found purchase. The man's grin spread wide across his face, though it did not reach his eyes. There was calculation there, an ugly kind of pleasure in testing the line that had been drawn in silence. He lifted his hand slowly, 2 fingers extended, and jabbed them into Daniel's chest with a quick, sharp motion. The sound of leather brushing against fabric was soft, but in the hush that had fallen, it seemed louder than it was. Daniel did not flinch. The force of the jab pressed against him, but his body absorbed it as though it were nothing more than wind. His boots stayed firm, heels dug into the pavement, chest steady against the intrusion. His eyes locked on the man's, unblinking, unmoved. The biker chuckled, the sound low and grating, repeating the motion with more pressure this time. "What now, old man?" he taunted. His voice was half laughter, half sneer, a tone designed to humiliate. Behind him, the others laughed again, their amusement reignited by the hope that the silence might finally crack, that the stranger might recoil or lash out and give them the excuse they craved. Emily's breath caught, her hand instinctively pressing back against Lily's shoulder. She could feel her daughter trembling, the small body pressed tightly against her, eyes wide and fixed on the confrontation. Emily wanted to call out, to plead for the man who had stepped in to be careful, but her throat closed, the words trapped beneath fear. Daniel's chest rose slowly as he inhaled, calm and even, his expression unchanged. He didn't step back. He didn't retaliate. His stillness itself was a response, a refusal to validate the gesture with either weakness or rage. His silence drew out the seconds, stretching them long, until the weight of them began to turn. The biker jabbed again, harder now, irritation flashing across his grin. He leaned closer, his breath carrying the stench of tobacco and cheap beer. "Come on," he goaded, voice dripping with challenge. "You gonna do something, or you just gonna stand there?" His words hung heavy, the mockery in them meant for both Daniel and the woman standing behind. But Daniel's eyes didn't waver. He stood like stone, unmoved by the taunt, unbroken by the jab. His posture carried a message the men weren't used to receiving. They hadn't unsettled him. If anything, their noise and their touch rolled off him like rain against armor. The others grew restless, laughter faltering again as they shifted their weight, uncertain. This wasn't how it was supposed to play out. The push was meant to provoke, to prove dominance, to expose fear. Instead, it exposed something else, an unyielding calm that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Emily's eyes flicked between them, heart pounding in her ears. She could see the difference, too, the imbalance beginning to shift in ways the men didn't yet understand. The jab to the chest, meant to diminish, had instead revealed a truth none of them wanted to face. Daniel Reyes wasn't there to be moved. He was there to stand, and stand he would until the storm broke. The jab came again, harder this time, meant to break the stillness Daniel held like a wall. For a split second, the world seemed caught between two possibilities, escalation or retreat. But Daniel made the choice for them. His hand shot up with a speed that didn't match the calm of his posture. In one smooth motion, He caught the biker's wrist, twisted sharply, and shifted his weight forward. The sound was subtle but unmistakable. The strain of tendons pulled in the wrong direction. The biker's laugh cutting off into a sharp gasp. Before the others could register what was happening, Daniel pivoted, his grip turning the man's own momentum against him. With a precise tug and downward press, he dropped the biker to one knee. The motion was clean, practiced, carried out with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar maneuvers countless times before, in places far more dangerous than this playground. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't brutal. It was exact. The man's free hand shot to Daniel's forearm, fingers clawing against the strength that held him down. His face twisted in a grimace, teeth clenched against the pain radiating from his wrist. Daniel's stance never faltered. His shoulders stayed square, his boots planted, his grip firm but not excessive. He controlled the angle with such precision that the biker was forced to stay down, neither fully broken nor free. Emily's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't even seen him move until it was already done. One moment the man was jabbing Daniel's chest with arrogant ease. The next he was kneeling in the dirt, forced low by nothing more than a twist of his wrist and the steady pressure of a stranger's hand. Lily's sobs quieted, her wide eyes fixed on the sudden shift in power. The other bikers froze, their laughter cut short. The smirks drained from their faces as they processed what had happened. One took half a step forward before stopping, uncertain whether to intervene. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been, filled with the unspoken realization that the dynamic had changed. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't glare. He didn't add insult to the man's injury. He simply held the biker there, letting the lesson settle in, then release his grip as abruptly as he had taken it. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his breathing ragged. Daniel straightened again, his stance returning to calm stillness, as though nothing had happened at all. The biker on his knees cursed under his breath, shaking his wrist, his pride wounded more deeply than his flesh. His companion shifted uneasily, eyes flicking from him to Daniel. The man who had been so quick to mock, so eager to invade another space, now looked smaller, diminished by the ease with which he had been put down. Emily exhaled, a shiver running through her body. The stranger hadn't needed to shout or swing wildly. He hadn't needed to prove himself with brute force. He had acted with control, precision, and restraint, enough to end the test without turning it into something worse. His silence afterward only deepened the impression. He wasn't there to fight for pride. He was there to draw a line, and he had done so without a single wasted word. The playground held still, every eye fixed on him. The man clutching his wrist stayed low, unwilling to rise too quickly, while his companion stood caught between anger and uncertainty. And Daniel, steady as stone, waited in silence, his message clear. They had tested his resolve and found it unshaken. The biker who had been forced to his knees stayed crouched in the dirt, clutching his wrist, his face twisted between pain and disbelief. The ease with which he had been put down stunned not only him but the others as well. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was heavy with the echo of what had just happened, too quick for them to stop, too controlled to dismiss as luck. The laughter that had filled the playground only minutes earlier had vanished, leaving behind a silence so raw it pressed against every ear. The two who still stood exchanged a glance, the kind of look men give when certainty slips from their grasp. Their swagger faltered, if only by a fraction, but was enough to reveal the crack forming beneath the surface. They had come in loud, confident, sure of their dominance, and in a single heartbeat it had been undone. Doubt crept in, subtle but undeniable, weaving into the way their shoulders stiffened, the way their eyes darted between each other and the stranger who now stood like an immovable wall before them. Emily felt it too. Her breath trembled as she exhaled, one arm instinctively pulling Lily tighter against her side. The child buried her face in her mother's jacket, her small fists clutching at the fabric, though her wide eyes peeked out just enough to see the man who had stepped in. Emily's own eyes widened, caught between awe and fear, unsure what would follow but certain that something had shifted. The men who had circled them no longer looked untouchable. For the first time since the engines had roared into the lot, she felt the faintest stirrings of hope. The biker with the scar broke the silence first, spitting into the dirt as though the act itself might restore the power he had just lost. His voice came out louder than necessary, brittle with anger. "You think you're tough, old man? You think that means anything?" His words carried force, but not conviction. The crack in his tone betrayed him. The one who had been circling earlier stepped forward now, his fists tightening at his sides. His face flushed with a sting of embarrassment that came from watching one of their own forced down so easily. He wanted to strike back, to erase the doubt clawing into his chest, but hesitation held him in place. He had seen the way the stranger had moved, quick and precise, like someone who didn't guess but knew exactly what he was doing. Daniel said nothing. His silence was heavier than any insult, his posture steady, unshaken, his eyes fixed on him with the calm of a man who had weathered worse storms. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply stood, and that stillness made their anger burn hotter, twisting into frustration. Emily's heart pounded, her hands trembling as she kept them around Lily, trying to shield her from sight. She felt the child's breath hot against her side, the small body pressed close in fear, but she dared not move. Any sudden shift might draw attention back to them, might break the fragile balance now tipping between fury and restraint. The two standing men bristled, their bravado dented, their pride demanding a response. Yet they didn't lunge. They didn't step fully into the space the way they had before. Doubt had settled in, and it showed in the way they lingered on the edge, unsure if another attempt would end the same way. Or worse. The playground, once filled with the sharp edges of their laughter, now pulsed with the raw tension of wounded pride. Anger burned in her eyes, but beneath it, the first threads of fear wound tighter. Emily saw it, and though her body was still taut with dread, she held her daughter closer, whispering nothing but her own breath into the child's hair. For the first time, she understood that these men were not as untouchable as they pretended to be. The stranger had proven it, and now all that was left was a storm of their reaction. Daniel's voice cut through the charged silence like the edge of a blade, low and steady, without the strain of effort. "You're done here," he said, each word deliberate and measured, leaving no space for misinterpretation. His gaze swept across the men, holding each one for a breath before moving to the next. "Walk away while you still can." The tone carried nothing theatrical, no raised volume or flourish of anger. It was calm, clipped, and it carried a weight that silence alone could not. It was the voice of someone who had spoken in darker places, under heavier skies, to men who carried far more than bravado. The bikers shifted uneasily. One of them scoffed under his breath, forcing a grin back onto his face as if to mask the hesitation settling in his shoulders. But the grin didn't reach his eyes. They had heard warnings before, but not like this. Most warnings were barked, frantic, meant to convince the speaker as much as the listener. This one was different. It carried certainty, not threat. It carried memory, the kind that made men pause without knowing why. Emily heard it too, the words wrapped around her like a shield, firm and immovable. She clutched Lily closer, her body still tense, but her mind beginning to catch the shift. Whoever this man was, his presence didn't just interrupt the danger. It bent it, reshaped it. She looked at him not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had chosen to stand in front of them with a steadiness she could never have conjured alone. The biker, still clutching his wrist, cursed, his voice shaky as he tried to stand taller. "You don't tell us where we can go," he spat, though the effort lacked conviction. The others glanced at him, their own bluster dimming, their confidence unraveling strand by strand. They had come looking for intimidation, but now they stood on ground that didn't feel theirs anymore. Daniel didn't step forward. He didn't need to. His stillness was a threat, his voice a line already drawn. He let the silence after his words stretch long enough for them to feel it pressing against their chests. His eyes carried no fear, no anger, only the certainty of a man who had seen what fear and anger could do if you let them in. He had lived through worse than 3 men in a playground. That truth sat in his voice, in his posture, in the deliberate calm of a soldier who had survived chaos and refused to bend for shadows. The tallest biker forced out a laugh, but it cracked midway, brittle as glass. He turned to his companions as if to gather strength in their numbers, but they did not return a look with the same bravado. Their silence betrayed them, a thin veil of noise covering doubt. Daniel's words lingered, echoing in the hollow space between the swings and the parking lot. Walk away while you still can. It wasn't bluster. It wasn't request. It was final, the kind of sentence that left no room for bargaining. Emily exhaled, her hands shaking as she smoothed them over Lily's hair. For the first time since the engines had split the quiet, she allowed herself to believe they might make it home without being broken. The men stood at the edge of decision, their pride warring with the heavy truth hanging in the stranger's voice. And though the night had not yet given up its answer, the weight of his warning pressed against them, making retreat feel closer than bravado could admit. The words slipped out almost without intent, a mutter low enough to seem accidental, yet heavy enough to change everything. "He's military," one of the bikers said, his voice quieter than before, but not so quiet that it went unheard. The sound of it carried through the tense air like a match struck in darkness. For the first time that night, the mocking tone broke, replaced with something else, recognition, laced with unease. The other two turned toward him, their brows furrowing. It wasn't disbelief that crossed their faces, but the sudden, reluctant acceptance of what they had already begun to suspect. The way Daniel had moved, the way he had dropped their friend to one knee without wasted effort, the way he stood unshaken by their noise, it all fit too neatly. Soldiers didn't bluff, not in the way men like them were used to. Soldiers didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't throw punches for show. They simply acted, and when they did, it was decisive. Daniel didn't respond to the muttered words. He didn't confirm, didn't deny. He simply let the silence stretch, his eyes steady on them, his posture unchanged. That was answer enough. The absence of denial felt louder than any declaration could have. His stillness held the weight of a man who had stood in places where bluffs cost lives, where hesitation left scars. Emily caught the shift instantly. She saw the way the bikers' bravado faltered, the way their laughter had dried into silence. Her heart still pounded in her chest. Her body still trembled from the fear of being surrounded. But she understood now what the men understood. This was not just an ordinary passerby. He carried himself with a discipline carved into bone, the kind you didn't lose when a uniform came off. She pulled Lily closer, her daughter's face pressed into her side, but her eyes stayed on the stranger. The hope she had felt before grew sharper, steadier. The biker with the scar cleared his throat, trying to restore the edge to his voice. "So what? Doesn't mean anything now," he said, but the words came out thinner than intended, lacking the steel they were supposed to carry. His eyes betrayed him, flicking down and away before returning. His companions didn't echo his attempt. They were too busy studying the man in front of them, their swagger stripped by the realization of what they faced. The one who had been muttering shook his head slightly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You can tell," he added, louder now, his voice rough, "the way he moves, the way he looks at you." It wasn't praise, but it was admission. He had seen enough men like Daniel to know. Daniel didn't shift, didn't offer them even a flicker of acknowledgement. His silence carried the weight of everything they were afraid to name. It told them he was prepared if they forced his hand, that he didn't need to convince them of anything. His eyes alone made clear he wasn't bluffing, and he never would be. The tension stretched taut, the playground caught between confrontation and retreat. The bikers stood less certain now, their bravado cracking under the simple truth spoken aloud. Emily clutched her daughter, her breath uneven, but her gaze never wavered from a man who stood steady. For the first time, the men looked smaller, their noise stripped away, their posturing thinned into silence. Recognition had taken hold, and with it came the one thing they hadn't expected to feel in this forgotten playground: doubt. The shift happened slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the men had to drag their pride out of the hole it had fallen into. The one clutching his wrist was the first to move, muttering a curse under his breath as he stepped backward, still grimacing from the sting of being forced down so easily. His boots scuffed the pavement as he avoided Daniel's gaze, his bravado stripped bare. The others hesitated, caught in that uncomfortable space between anger and realization. They had come to the playground expecting laughter, control, the satisfaction of watching someone smaller shrink beneath their noise. Instead, they had found themselves staring into the unflinching silence of a man who refused to yield. The biker with the scar spat into the dirt, a sharp sound meant to reclaim some sense of dominance, but it landed flat, without the weight it once carried. "This ain't over," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. His companions didn't echo him. Instead, they shoved at each other, trying to cover hesitation with motion, grumbling curses that fell more on themselves than on the man who had stood them down. Daniel didn't move. He didn't need to. His boots remained planted, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes steady as the men stumbled toward their retreat. His silence followed them like a shadow, making their curses sound hollow, their bravado thin. He knew better than to chase them, better than to shout after them. Men like that fed on reactions. Deny them one, and their retreat became its own humiliation. Emily held Lily close, her hand trembling against her daughter's back as she watched the men step away. She barely dared to breathe until they had put enough distance between themselves and the swings. Her eyes followed them to the edge of the lot, her heart pounding with the fear that one might turn back, that one might decide to push further. But none of them did. Their shoulders hunched beneath leather jackets, their curses muttered into the chill air. They looked smaller now, stripped of the power they had tried to project. Engines sputtered to life, one after another, coughing smoke into the cooling evening. The sound that had once filled the playground with menace now sounded like retreat, rough and hurried. The men swung their legs over the bikes with less grace than they had arrived with, their movements sharp with frustration rather than confidence. They shoved at each other, muttering complaints, each one desperate to leave without admitting the truth, that they had been undone by silence and precision. The roar of the engines grew louder, filling the lot with smoke and vibration. Exhaust fumes curled into the fading light, carrying the stench of gasoline across the grass. The bikers revved their throttles, not because they needed to, but because noise was all they had left. They drowned the silence they couldn't conquer with sound, try and convince themselves they still owned the space they were already abandoning. Daniel didn't so much as blink. He stood tall, letting the roar wash over him, his expression unchanged. Emily noticed it. The calmness of his posture, the refusal to meet bluster with bluster. He had already won, and he didn't need to remind anyone of it. The motorcycles lurched forward, tires spitting gravel, engines howling as they tore back toward the road. Their voices were lost in the noise now, curses swallowed by the roar, until only the fading growl of engines remained. Smoke trailed behind them, curling upward before dissolving into the cooling air. When the sound finally faded into distance, the playground was quiet again. The only noises that lingered were the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of the swing's chains, and the uneven breaths of mother holding her daughter close. The men were gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their retreat and the steady figure of the man who had stood against them without raising his voice. The roar of the engines faded into the distance, leaving only the faint smell of gasoline and smoke hanging in the air. The silence that followed was almost jarring, pressing down after the chaos like a heavy blanket. For a moment, Emily didn't move. She stood frozen, her arms wrapped tight around Lily, her chest rising and falling with shallow, hurried breaths. The playground, which had moments before felt like a trap closing in, now stood empty again. Its rusted frames and peeling paint returned to the stillness, an ordinary evening. Only the faint squeak of the swing's chains carried across the air, a reminder where everything had started. Slowly, Emily lowered herself to her knees beside her daughter. Lily still clung to her sleeve, her small hands shaking as if they hadn't yet received the message that the danger had passed. Emily brushed back strands of hair that had fallen across her daughter's face, tucking them gently behind her ear. "It's okay now," she whispered, her voice softer than the wind stirring the fallen leaves. "They're gone. You're safe." Lily's wide eyes searched her mother's face for truth. Tears still clung to her lashes, glistening in the dimming light. She hiccuped quietly, the sound small and broken, and leaned into her mother's touch. Emily smoothed her hand down the back of her daughter's head, rocking slightly as though to recreate the comfort of home here in the open air. The swing swayed slowly, still carrying the echo of motion from earlier. Its squeak filled the silence in uneven intervals, the kind of sound that might have been ordinary on any other day, but now felt almost haunting. Emily focused on it, steadying her breath in time with its rhythm, trying to let the repetition ease the frantic beating in her chest. Each squeak reminded her that they had endured the worst of it, that the moment was behind them, even if its shadow still lingered. "Mom." Lily's voice broke the quiet, fragile and uncertain. Emily pressed her forehead gently against her daughter's and whispered again, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She pulled her close, wrapping both arms around her as if to convince them both of the truth in her words. The park itself seemed to exhale, its stillness no longer suffocating but slowly shifting toward calm. The leaves rustled lightly overhead, stirred by a breeze that had carried away the smoke of the motorcycles. The slide stood motionless, the merry-go-round silent, the broken basketball hoop leaning at its usual angle, all of it familiar, all of it returning to what it had always been. Emily let her hand linger on Lily's cheek, wiping away the wetness with her thumb. The child's breathing began to even out, though it still carried the occasional shudder. Emily whispered again and again, "You're safe," the words more like a mantra than a reassurance, something she needed to hear herself as much as her daughter did. For the first time, she dared to glance past the swing, to the figure who still stood steady a few feet away. He hadn't moved much, his presence quiet, his gaze steady. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he had chosen to step in, but she understood enough. His silence had been stronger than their noise, his calm heavier than their threats. He had made it possible for her to kneel here now, whispering to her daughter in a playground that once again belonged to them. The squeak of the swings carried on, gentle now, almost lulling. Emily smoothed Lily's hair, kissed her temple, and held her close, whispering promises that tonight they would go home. Tonight they would be all right. Daniel let the silence settle, the kind of quiet that stretches after tension is finally broken. He stood for a few moments longer, his posture still steady, eyes sweeping the playground one final time to be certain the threat was gone. Only the lingering smoke in the air and the faint vibration of engines fading into the distance reminded him that the bikers had been there at all. His work, as he saw it, was finished. Without a word, he turned back toward the bench where he had left his things. The paper bag sat exactly where he had placed it, folded neatly at the top, sagging slightly under the weight of its simple contents. Bread, coffee, milk, ordinary items for an ordinary evening. They had waited for him while the world tilted briefly into confrontation, as though nothing had changed. He reached down and lifted the bag, adjusting his grip so the thin handles wouldn't split beneath the weight. His movements were slow, deliberate, carrying none of the tension that had defined his earlier precision. To him, the moment of violence, brief and controlled, had already been filed away as necessary action. Not remarkable, not dramatic, just done. Emily watched from where she knelt by Lily. She saw him retrieve the bag with the quiet detachment of someone who had stepped into fire and emerged untouched. There was no expectation in his manner, no glance in her direction to invite gratitude. He carried himself as though the entire confrontation had been incidental, as though his role had ended the moment the men chose to retreat. Lily peeked up at him too, her small face streaked with the remnants of tears. She didn't speak, but her wide eyes followed his every step. She saw not the bread or the coffee in his hand, but the calm in the way he carried it. The same calm that had stood unshaken when the men tried to break him. Daniel adjusted his cap with his free hand, tugging the brim lower against the fading light. He prepared to continue the walk he had started, the same path home that he had taken countless times before. He expected nothing more from the evening. He had intervened because it was right, not because he sought recognition. To him, thanks or acknowledgement didn't belong to moments like these. They were distractions. Doing the right thing was its own conclusion. The air around him still carried traces of fear and relief, but he walked as though untouched by it. His boots pressed against the pavement with the same rhythm as when he had first entered the park. Steady, unhurried. The confrontation was behind him, and he had no intention of lingering in its echo. Emily felt the urge to call out, to say something before he vanished back into the world as quietly as he had arrived. But for a heartbeat, she hesitated, overcome by the strangeness of his calm. He did not act like a savior expecting admiration, nor like a stranger demanding acknowledgement. He acted like a man who had stepped in, finished what needed to be done, and was content to disappear again without a trace. Daniel didn't look back. With the paper bag in hand and the last light of the evening casting long shadows behind him, he moved as if the incident was nothing more than a wrinkle in his day, a small detour on the way home. To him, it was over. The thanks, if it came, would never be the reason he had stopped in the first place. Emily's lips parted before she even realized she was going to speak. For a moment, nothing came out, only the quick rhythm of her breath, uneven and shallow. The man was already walking away, the paper bag swinging lightly at his side, his broad frame receding with each step. It struck her then, how quietly he had inserted himself into the storm, how quickly he had steadied it, and how easily he seemed prepared to fade back into the night as though none of it mattered. The thought of letting him vanish without a word pressed against her chest, heavier than the fear that had gripped her only minutes ago. "Wait," she called, her voice trembling, thinner than she intended. The single word carried across the empty playground, sharp against the silence that had followed the biker's retreat. The man slowed, one boot pausing against a gravel path. Though he didn't turn immediately, Emily swallowed hard, tightening her arm around Lily, who looked up at her with wide, damp eyes. The child said nothing, but her gaze flicked to the stranger as if she too understood the importance of this moment. Emily tried again, her voice breaking but steady enough to reach him. "Thank you." The words felt fragile on her tongue, yet when they left her lips, they seemed to anchor themselves in the cooling air. They weren't just gratitude. They were disbelief, relief, a recognition of something she hadn't thought she would ever see, that someone had stood up for her when she had been forced to stand alone for so long. Daniel turned then, just enough for her to see his profile beneath the shadow of his cap. His expression remained calm, unchanging, but his pause acknowledged her words more deeply than any flourish could. Emily's breath hitched, her hand smoothing over Lily's hair as though the repetition could steady her. She had been braced for so long to fight her battles alone, to bear every cruel glance and mocking word without help, that the act of someone stepping into the fire beside her felt almost unreal. Most people wouldn't, she added, her voice softer now, meant more for herself than for him. The truth of it trembled in the space between them. She had lost count of the number of times silence had been the response of others, neighbors who looked away, strangers who pretended not to hear. She had taught herself to expect nothing, to believe that the weight of being a single mother was hers to carry in isolation. And yet here was this man, who had asked for no explanation, demanded no thanks, and still placed himself squarely between her daughter and danger. Daniel shifted slightly, his free hand adjusting the brim of his cap. He did not speak right away, but the way he stood, the way he turned just enough to hear her, was answer enough. Emily's heart swelled with something she couldn't name, something that lived between gratitude and awe, between disbelief and relief. Her voice trembled once more, but she forced herself to steady it. "You didn't have to, but you did." She pressed her lips together, blinking against the sting of tears she had kept at bay during the confrontation. Now, in the safety of the quiet, they threatened to fall. The playground, empty and still, seemed to cradle her words, carrying them to him without interruption. He didn't step closer, didn't seek more, but in the way he stood, she knew he had heard. And for Emily, who had forgotten what it felt like to not stand alone, that acknowledgement was enough. Daniel's reply was as measured as every step he had taken across the playground. He didn't fill the silence with explanations, nor did he soften it with platitudes. He only gave a small nod, the kind that seemed to carry the weight of years, and spoke in a voice low but firm, just doing what's right. The words were simple, stripped of flourish, yet they carried the gravity of something lived rather than learned. Emily felt them settle in her chest, heavier than she expected. It wasn't just the act of protection that struck her, but the absence of self-interest in his tone. He hadn't come forward seeking thanks. He hadn't lingered for validation. His presence had been an answer to a moment, nothing more, nothing less. The way he said it, quiet, almost reluctant, made clear that to him, stepping in had never been a question. It was a duty, ingrained so deeply that it required no thought, no weighing of consequences. Lily, still pressed against her mother's side, peeked out at him with wide eyes. The child's breathing had slowed, though her grip on Emily's sleeve remained tight. She studied the man as if trying to understand how someone could walk into the storm and walk out again, without carrying its noise. Daniel didn't notice her stare, or if he did, he didn't show it. His attention had already shifted back toward the path, toward the simple errand he had interrupted. Emily wanted to say more, to ask his name, to tell him how much it meant that he had stood there when no one else would. But she saw in his stance that he didn't expect conversation, didn't invite it. His nod, his words, with the end of it in his mind. He had drawn the line, forced the danger back, and now it was time to leave behind. There was something almost humbling in that restraint. She had met men who puffed themselves up on the smallest gestures, who demanded recognition for even noticing her struggle. Daniel asked for nothing. He didn't need to. His calm silence spoke more loudly than any demand for thanks ever could. He adjusted the paper bag in his hand, the weight of ordinary groceries contrasting sharply with the tension that had filled the playground only minutes ago. To him, it seemed the night was returning to what it had been before. Bread, milk, coffee, the small necessities of living. He didn't let the confrontation define the moment. He let it dissolve, treating it as something done, finished, not worth carrying further. Emily felt a swell of words caught in her throat, gratitude that wanted to spill out but couldn't find shape. She knew anything she said would sound inadequate, smaller than what the moment deserved. So she only tightened her arms around Lily, allowing the stranger's reply to be the last word. Daniel gave one final glance, not long enough to linger, but long enough to assure himself that mother and child were safe. Then he turned, boots pressing into gravel with the same steady rhythm as before. He didn't look back. His shoulders remained squared, his steps even, carrying him away without pause. He hadn't come for recognition, and he wouldn't stay for it. His words echoed in Emily's mind as she watched him fade into the distance, just doing what's right. In them, she heard the calm certainty of someone who had lived through worse, someone for whom standing up was not an act of heroism, but a reflex of character. And though he didn't linger, though he walked away without asking for anything, the imprint of his presence remained, etched into the quiet playground, into Emily's memory, into Lily's wide, searching eyes. The air in the playground felt lighter now, though its stillness carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Emily remained kneeling in the gravel, one hand smoothing Lily's hair, the other brushing at her own damp cheeks where fear had left its mark. The stranger's footsteps had already faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet streets beyond the lot. Yet his presence lingered, as though the echo of his calm still hung in the cool evening air. Lily tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, her small fingers curling into the worn fabric, as if she were afraid to let go. Her voice came hesitant, broken slightly by the last traces of tears. "Who is he?" she asked, her words carrying more than simple curiosity. There was awe in them, too, the wide-eyed wonder of a child who had just witnessed something she couldn't fully understand but knew was important. Emily looked down at her daughter, meeting the fragile innocence in her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. How could she explain a man like that in terms a 7-year-old could grasp? She thought of his silence, his stillness, the way he had moved with certainty when the danger pressed too close. She thought of how he had spoken not with anger, but with a calm that carried the weight of someone who had already seen worse. Her throat tightened, her mind chasing words that seemed too fragile to hold the truth. "Someone who knew when to help," she said at last, her voice low, her tone gentle. The answer wasn't everything, but it was enough for Lily. The girl blinked, her face softening as she leaned into her mother's arms. "He was brave," she whispered, almost as though saying it too loudly would break the magic of it. Emily nodded, pressing her lips to the crown of her daughter's head. Brave wasn't quite the word she had chosen, but she let it stand. Brave was the way a child explained what she had seen, and in that simplicity, there was truth. Emily thought back to the moments when the bikers had closed in, their voices sharp, their laughter cruel. She remembered how small she had felt standing in their shadow, her body trembling even as she forced herself to stand tall. She remembered Lily's whisper, her plea to go home. And then she remembered the still figure at the edge of the park, the man who had stepped forward without hesitation, his silence louder than their noise, his resolve unshaken. She had never expected anyone to step in for her, not in this world where she had learned to stand alone. Yet he had, And that truth left her shaken in ways she hadn't realized until now. Lily tilted her head back, her wide eyes searching the path where the stranger had disappeared. "Will he come back?" she asked, her voice fragile but hopeful. Emily smoothed her hand down her daughter's cheek, forcing a small smile. "Maybe," she said softly, "but even if he doesn't, he was here when we needed him." The child nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the empty path as though expecting him to reappear. Emily held her tighter, feeling the truth of her own words settle in her chest. Whoever he was, wherever he'd come from, he had arrived in the moment that mattered most. And for that, she would always remember him, not as a name or a story, but as a figure who stepped in when no one else would. The swing creaked faintly behind them, swaying in the cooling evening air. Emily rose slowly, taking Lily's hand in hers. "Come on," she murmured, her voice steadier now. "Let's go home." But even as they turned away, she knew her daughter's question would stay with her long after the night was over, echoing in her mind with the same quiet weight as the man's reply. Someone who knew when to help. The morning came quietly, with sunlight spilling across the small town in thin, golden streaks. The streets, still damp from the night's dew, held their usual rhythm, delivery trucks rattling over potholes, shopkeepers rolling up shutters, and the faint hum of conversation seeping from the local diner on Main Street. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds lay something different, a current that hadn't been there the day before. Inside the diner, the clatter of plates and the hiss of the coffee pot mixed with low voices that carried an edge of intrigue. People leaned across booths and counters, their words hushed at first, then sharper as confidence grew. It didn't take long before the same story was being retold in different versions, each carrying the same core: a group of bikers, a single mother, a child, and a man who had stood against it all without raising his voice. A waitress in her 40s, hair pulled into a bun, shook her head as she poured coffee for a pair of regulars. "I heard." He didn't even throw a punch, just stood there, calm as anything, and they backed down. Her voice carried admiration, tinged with disbelief. The man at the counter, a mechanic with grease still staining his hands, leaned forward, curiosity alive in his expression. "That's not what I heard. My cousin's kid was walking past the park. Said one of the bikers tried to shove him, and this guy twisted his wrist so quick the fella dropped like a rock. Didn't even look winded." Across the room, a younger woman spoke to her friend over pancakes. Emily Harper, wasn't it? She was there with her little girl. People say he put himself right in front of them, like a wall. Didn't even hesitate. Her friend frowned, nodding slowly, the story taking shape in her mind. Every retelling sharpened the edges, but the essence remained the same. A soldier, though no one knew his name yet, had faced down men who thrived on intimidation, and he had done it without shouting, without grandstanding, just silence and certainty. By mid-morning, the story had spread beyond the diner. At the hardware store, customers lingered longer at the counter, their conversations circling back to what they'd heard. At the gas station, a clerk mentioned it in passing, shaking his head as he handed change to a customer. Even at the schoolyard, parents exchanged glances and whispers, their voices dropping as they asked if it was true. Emily's name surfaced often, though she herself kept quiet. Some said she'd been shaken but unhurt. Others that she hadn't spoken much at all about it, only holding her daughter close as they left the park. But no one missed the detail that mattered most. Someone had stood for her when the town had grown too used to looking the other way. By noon, the whispers had become something steadier. They weren't just recounting what happened anymore. They were wondering who he was. Ex-military, someone said at the grocery store, confident in their guess. You could tell, the way he stood, the way he didn't flinch. Another added, whoever he is, he's not just passing through. You don't move like that unless it's carved into you. The story grew with the day, wrapping itself into the town's rhythm until it was part of every conversation. Spoken over coffee, over fences, across shop counters. The soldier who faced down bikers without raising his voice had become more than a stranger. He was a presence, a reminder, a whisper carried from one ear to the next. And though no one yet knew his name, everyone seemed to sense that he had shifted something in the town, leaving behind a silence stronger than noise and a story that would not soon be forgotten. It didn't take long before the whispers that filled the town found a name to attach themselves to. By late afternoon, as the story made its rounds from the diner to the hardware store, from the gas pumps to the barber shop, someone finally spoke it aloud. Daniel Reyes, the name carried, heavy with recognition. A man at the counter of the diner said it first, his tone certain, as if the answer had been waiting on his tongue all morning. Heads turned when he spoke, forks paused midway to mouths, and suddenly the quiet buzz of speculation had a focal point. The name spread quickly, confirming what many had already suspected. He wasn't just any passerby who happened to stumble across trouble. He was a man with history, a man whose silence had been shaped elsewhere, in places where silence was survival. Daniel Reyes, people said, had served overseas years ago. The details varied depending on who told it. Some swore it was the Middle East, others thought it was further back, maybe in places the news no longer spoke of. But all agreed on one thing. He had been decorated for his service, commended for acts that most couldn't imagine, and now he lived quietly on the edge of town, as if wanting the world to forget what he had carried. The waitress with the bun shook her head as she refilled coffee cups. I remember his name on the honor roll in the paper. Came back with medals, but never talked about them. Man like that doesn't need to. Her voice softened as she spoke, a quiet reverence threading through her words. Others nodded, adding fragments to the story. He's been here a while. Bought that small house past the old mill road. Keeps to himself. Another chimed in, always polite. Doesn't say much, though. You wouldn't guess what he's seen. The more they spoke, the clearer his image became. Not the stranger who had walked into the playground, but the man who had walked through their streets unnoticed for years, living in quiet obscurity until the night demanded he step forward. Emily heard his name later that evening, whispered to her by a neighbor who had stopped by with a casserole she hadn't asked for. Daniel Reyes, the woman said, her eyes wide, her tone carrying both relief and awe. That's who stood up for you. He's not just anyone, Emily. He's a soldier, decorated, the kind who doesn't bluff. The word sent a shiver through Emily, though not a fear. They settled into her like pieces falling into place. She thought back to the calm in his eyes, the way he had absorbed their noise without flinching, the precision of his movements when the biker pushed too far. It all made sense now. Lily, listening from the couch, lifted her head from her mother's lap. Daniel, she whispered, trying the name as if it carried magic. Her eyes softened, her young mind holding onto the story in a way that would shape how she remembered bravery for years to come. For Emily, the name was more than a fact. It was a revelation that the man who had stepped into her life, if only briefly, wasn't a myth or a ghost, but someone very real, someone whose past explained the strength he carried so quietly. She wondered what it meant to live like that, decorated, respected, but choosing instead a life of quiet on the edge of town. She wondered if the weight of memory was heavier than the medals themselves. By nightfall, the town had stopped asking who he was. They knew Daniel Reyes, veteran, decorated, living quietly, but never truly gone from the role that defined him. And for Emily, that knowledge carried both gratitude and a strange, deep respect, the kind that would linger long after the echoes of the playground had faded. The light was fading, the sky painted in soft streaks of orange and violet as the last warmth of the day surrendered to the cool of evening. The playground, once filled with the echo of mocking voices and the hum of engines, had returned to its silence. Only the faint squeak of the swings and the rustle of leaves in the breeze remained. Emily stood slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling in the gravel, and reached for Lily's hand. The little girl's fingers slipped into hers, small and warm, clinging tightly as though letting go would mean losing the fragile sense of safety they had only just reclaimed. Emily brushed the dust from her jacket, steadied her breathing, and guided her daughter toward the gate at the edge of the playground. Each step felt like an exhale, a release of fear that had coiled so tightly inside her chest. Lily stayed close, her head tilted up every so often to search her mother's face, looking for reassurance that the worst was over. Emily answered each glance with a gentle squeeze of her hand and the faintest smile, a promise that they were safe, that they were going home. Across the street, Daniel walked alone. The paper bag swung lightly at his side, its weight ordinary, its presence grounding after the storm. His steps were steady, unhurried, his figure outlined against the dimming glow of the sun. He didn't look back at the playground, didn't linger on what had unfolded. For him, it was already finished, folded into the long, quiet ledger of moments when doing what was right required no witness and no reward. Emily noticed him in the distance. She slowed for a moment, watching his broad shoulders, the way his silhouette stretched across the cracked sidewalk, steady and unbent. He carried himself not with pride but with dignity, the kind that asked for nothing in return. She thought of the stories she had heard that day, the whispers of his name, the recognition of what he had once been, a decorated veteran, a man who had seen more than most could imagine, now living quietly at the edge of town. He didn't wear his past like armor. He carried it like a shadow, unseen but always present. Lily tugged her mother's sleeve, her voice soft. "He's still here." Emily nodded, her throat tightening with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but also a quiet awe. "Yes," she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't remain long. Men like him didn't stay to soak in thanks or recognition. They left as quietly as they came, letting their actions speak in the silence that followed. The three of them moved in different rhythms, mother and daughter hand in hand, the soldier walking alone. But for a brief moment, their paths ran parallel under the fading light. Emily held on to that image, knowing it would remain etched in her memory long after this evening had slipped into the folds of ordinary days. Daniel disappeared down the block, his figure merging with the shadows stretching across the town. Emily and Lily crossed the street together, their joined hands steady, their steps lighter than they had been when the engines first shattered the peace. The legacy he left behind wasn't written in medals or parades, but in the safety of mother and child walking home, and in the quiet dignity of a man who chose to protect without needing to be seen.